Okay, so the four color process is used in a lot of commercial work. If you've ever taken a look at a box of cereal, for example, you'll notice these blocks of color or sometimes little circles of color on it. Those are called, let me make sure I say this right, process control patches, or sometimes those process control marks, dots, depending on how you want to put it. What they are in general is a way for the printer to determine if a color looks wrong on the box, if it's because something's too bright or something's too dim. And you can do that just by looking at the squares of ink that are being printed across the thing. Now, sometimes you won't see those, and that's because they get cropped off on the excess stuff. But you'll notice something here. We have CMYK on this one, but we also have like a 50% lightness going on, so we can get like gray and light blue and pink and yellow. Over here, we don't even have yellow because this particular box didn't need it. But you'll notice that the image is very clear on a lot of commercial artwork that you'll see on like cereal boxes and packaging. It's because the dots on these things are really, really tiny. So you'll be able to get really photorealistic work reprinted pretty easily on the cheap doing it this way. This particular assignment's going to have much larger dots, so you're going to need to plan for that as you work through it and figure out how you want to work around those. Also, you'll notice a lot of times you'll have this little mark. Sometimes you'll also see one that has like a little line somewhere, usually right by the edge. This is called a registration mark, and the idea is that as you're printing the different colors on top of each other, you need to line them all up correctly. The registration mark allows you to do that. And in fact, in traditional illustration, when you're doing a drawing of something and you're going to be using a lot of tracing paper, you'll put a little registration marks on your paper right around the edge where you can erase it, and then you can lay down your sheet of tracing paper on top of it, and it will line up perfectly, and you can do tracing paper after tracing paper. And the same kind of principle is used when you're doing these commercial prints. These things will line up really, really well. These, if you ever see them kind of by the edge, sometimes they're red or different colors. Those are called crop marks. That's where the image or the paper was supposed to be cut short, and there's kind of a reason for that. So if you have a poster and you ran this through a bunch of quick and dirty processes, and you're just running this through, and you have the different cyan, magenta, yellow, black, all those guys going in, and you have each screen brought in one at a time. You lay it down so that it matches up on the registration marks, so you don't have to worry about it, and you rub your color across it, and you get the color, you get the everything lined up perfectly. So hopefully you won't have little lines of white space where your paper is, or brown space if you have brown paper, whatever color it is. There's another approach to that though, where you actually make the underlying colors. So again, you want the lightest to the darkest. Make the underlying colors larger so you don't have a gap. So for example, if you had a light square and a dark square, and you could, and they're touching each other. So just as a quick actual demonstration, let me make a dark square here. So you have a dark square, right? And for consistency's sake, let's make this a bluish tint. Assuming that I can get my paint bucket, there we go. And then you might also have a light square. So this is all that I'm talking about, like say yellow, which is the lightest one that you'd end up having. So what you do with this while you're making your screen is you would actually come in and you would separate these two pieces apart, right? And then you'd line them up very carefully because you're doing it realistically. But and then you'd print, one for blue, one for yellow. But before you do that, the lighter colors, you'd expand them out so that they fit underneath. So there's a bit of an underlap rather than an overlap. So in this case, you'd just go in and do this. And you do it very carefully, not slapdash like I'm doing right now. And you do it on the correct layer, which is always a problem I've had since the dawn of time. So now there's an underlap, which means if this gets offset a little bit in some direction, you won't end up with a white line between it as you would if they were right next to each other, or whatever color the background happens to be. This underflow is generally referred to as something called color trapping. And the idea is that you kind of trap the colors so that they can't end up somewhere where they shouldn't be. Okay, but getting back to the cereal box for a moment, this isn't the only way to print, though. We talked about how you also have the frequency modulation process, but even within a halftone or a screening printing process, there are other ways. So this is the 4-color process, right? We're using cyan, yellow, magenta, and black. Printers use this sort of version of that. But there's another process called spot color. Now, spot color means that each color that you decide to use, whatever it is going to be mixed. And it's either mixed at a factory and sent to you or your printer, or it's mixed by hand. And let me show you something pretty cool. So if you pop open your swatches, and let me reset these swatches real quick, you'll notice that, yeah, go ahead, reset. No, don't save any changes. So normally you have these default swatches that Photoshop just comes with. But if you come to the flyout, you have a bunch of things called Pantone or Pantone. I always want to say Pantone, but it's Pantone. And if we bring these up, we have coded and uncoded. You'll see that a lot. So coded is, and we'll append these, coded is referring to the paper that it's going to go on. If it's a glossy paper, it's coded. That looks really good for, photographs and stuff. But if you want more of a handmade feel, uncoded would be the matte finish. And so we load in the uncoated ones. And those are generally referred to as like Pantone U or Pantone C for uncoated or coated. Anyway, if you go over these, you'll see that it says like P5916-C, or if I mouse over this one, a little text will pop up, or it should pop up. And this will be Pantone P97-14C. These are the different colors. And there are a lot of colors. They have a crazy number of them. And you can actually get little swatch books. Let me bring one up real quick. They can be quite pricey, and there's a reason for that. So here's a little formula guide, coded and uncoded. So what you want is for each of these colors, which is everything Pantone sells, to essentially be represented in it. Now, whenever you're adding in an ink, you're adding in cost. That's a whole tub of something that's being used. So when you're an artist, you're probably going to want to, decide in advance how much you want these things to cost if you're getting a bunch of them printed up. And each one of those inks is going to add to the cost. Now, if you're doing a company logo and, for example, Starbucks wants the Starbucks green, they're going to not really care that much because, they're rich. They're going to just put that into whatever they're doing. Anyway, so they're expensive. There's a reason for that. First, you need a paper that matches the paper you're going to be using, because the kind of paper, the color of the paper, that will change what the color looks like once it's laid on top of it. Second, exposure to light is going to fade the Pantone swatches. So you're going to have to be very careful with them and keep them in dark places. So all of these swatches have to be stored someplace dark. They have to be on special kinds of paper, uncoated, coated, what have you. They have to have lots and lots of samples. This is getting pretty expensive pretty quickly just to get a hold of these. But it's also important that you have one and your client has one if you're running a print. And the reason is, you remember how much calibration we had to do just to get things looking the way that we wanted them to look? And remember how I said that calibrating the monitor had to be done depending on the time of day, the sort of lighting, all that stuff? A client's not going to do that. The best thing you can do is have them purchase one of these, send it on out, and you may be the client. You may be the person that's getting the print. Send them on out, tell them look at it in direct northern sunlight, and then they'll be able to see the colors that they're going to get through these swatches. Now, I'm not sure if we can see this. On here, here we go. See this? It has a percentage of like 98.5 and 1.5. It's Pantone yellow and Pantone black. For every 98.5% of a tub of Pantone yellow, if you add in a 1.5% of Pantone black, you'll get this 103 color, theoretically, if you're mixing it yourself. So if you're mixing these, you actually just purchase, for example, Pantone yellow, Pantone black, and mix them together. I've been told that if you follow these formulas exactly, they're not going to turn out how you expect. So you need someone who's a good color spotter to look at it, and they'll start mixing in small amounts of other colors, and it's a real art, and they'll get it looking exactly the way that the swatch actually is. So if the client says, I want Pantone, what is this one? Pantone 104U for this. You take a look at your uncoded Pantone and you'd mix in the percentages that they recommend. So it looks like be about 5.9% black and 94.1% yellow. You'd mix all that up and you do a little dab on paper and it would not look right when it's done. And so then you'd add whatever you need to add. Voila, you get it wherever you need it. And it takes a while. It's an art in and of itself. So the long and short of it is spot colors, where someone is mixing something, is more precise. It can be incredibly beautiful, but it's much more expensive. And that's not even getting into the idea that you can use rare materials to mix these. Like, what if you wanted something that couldn't be produced on a computer, couldn't be produced by a standard printer? You could grind up some semi-precious stones and mix them in. Pretty much any, and then use that as a paint. Pretty much any dust can be loaded into these paints, mixed in, and used with the silk screening process or the halftone printing process. And when you do that, you can do stuff like mix in oils to make smells, so you get scratch and sniff. You can mix in glow-in-the-dark materials, and you have these colors glow in the dark. You can do all kinds of absolutely crazy stuff to get this where you want it. And so you could get like glow-in-the-dark cereal boxes, and sometimes, around October, they'll have some ghosts and stuff stuck on there, and sure enough, they'll glow in the dark. They've mixed something in to their screen printing process. Now, again, ours is a conceptual printer, so we're not going to have to worry about that for this assignment, but it's important that you know about this kind of stuff in case it comes up later in your career. I don't want you flying blind in here. I want you to be able to actually go through. So speaking of which, those crop marks, I referred to them. Sometimes they're next to registration marks, and sometimes they're not. Let me talk about the purpose of that and why, if you're doing a t-shirt, you probably do something a little bit different. One other thing while I still have swatches open. Pretty much anytime you're buying inks from someone, they should theoretically have swatches you can load in. And in fact, specialty printers should also have swatches you can load in, and you can use just those colors when you're filling stuff in. That tends to work better for Illustrator, where you can easily swap out colors, but for designing in Photoshop, if you know where you're ending up, this works really well too, and kind of plan on it, kind of know what you're doing and getting into. Pick the colors that you know you can reproduce. Pick the ones that you know you can afford, because if you use like 500 different coded colors, expect a high price when you're doing a spot color print. That's going to cost you a fortune. If you use like 2 or 3 of them, talk to your printer and they'll tell you about it. But you can load in additional swatches here by doing a load swatch, or you can create your own swatches and you can save those. But again, you have to calibrate your screen, and you have to hope that whoever created these swatches had their screens calibrated and all that stuff. Swatch books are generally the way to go when you're picking it, but then when you're setting it up, you need to have the digital swatch theoretically match the swatch here. So in fact, if you're doing spot colors and stuff, that's very important that you load in the swatches here. You take a look at what they will actually look like when they're done. And when you send it off to the printer, they should be able to load this up and go, oh, hey, this is a Pantone P95 coated. And then they know how to mix that one up when they go and print it. So there's all kinds of proofing done, to be done, all sorts of stuff. When you start getting into printing at that level, you're going to want to talk with your printer, you're going to want to work with them. Don't be shy to say, hey, this is really the first time I've done a big scale print like this. What are questions that you wish your clients had asked you when they were going in? Have them walk through that. Say, what sort of things should I be looking out for? What sort of costs should I expect? All of those sorts of things. All right, so speaking of, if you decide to do it yourself, though, and you're mixing up all of your own colors, more power to you. That could be a lot of fun. Now, what you need to do, if you were doing a poster, what tends to happen is people will work on paper that's quite a bit bigger than whatever they intend to do so that they can crop it down. So if you decided to, have some form of image looking over printed on your poster, you wouldn't want to go all the way to the edge if you're doing these prints yourself using a silk screen process or 4-color process with your squeegee and your inks and all that good stuff. If you're doing that sort of thing, you'd want to do registration marks, those little X's, so that every time you line up whatever silk screen color you're going to be lining up, and every every spot color that you've mixed yourself to go in is going to need its own screen to line up. So you could have dozens of these, who knows how many. And by the way, this dates back to Mucha. Let me bring one of those up real quick, just so that you have an idea. Guarantee you've seen, if not his work, something inspired by Alphonse Mucha. This guy, man, he's a legend. He did some absolutely amazing work, especially in the 20s, towards the end of his life, in the 30s. And these things are huge. These are like 5 feet tall for some of these. I don't know for sure if this is one of the 5 foot tall ones, but these were done using a lithographic process where you actually do all of this on a stone and then run the inks one at a time, kind of like your screen printing process, but instead the inks pull up on the stone. That's a whole nother thing. That's a whole other art. If you're at Modesto Junior College, East Campus, Rob Stevenson over in the art department actually does this kind of work. Talk to him about Alphonse. Just swing by his office. Don't just knock during his office hours and say, hey, I have some questions about Alphonse Mocha. Eric Greenberg sent me over. I was wondering if you could tell me about doing lithography printing. And let's see if I can get this right in one go. This is more of an FM print than a AM print. Oh, I got really close. So with the lithography printing, you roll these things out, and there are so many different ways to do this. This is a whole nother way. And honestly, this can also produce absolutely amazing works. Don't lock yourself into just the way that I show you. There's 1,000 ways to cook an egg. Honestly, there's so many things that you can do. These big pieces of equipment that you see, it presses things down. That's one way you can do it. You can have a stamp. You can roll stuff over. Look into it. It's really interesting. But I digress. This though was a multicolor process, even though it wasn't screen printing. It was pulling the inks up. Again, that's more of an FM process than an AM process. And then he'd roll it up one at a time, and he'd do all the adjustments to it, and he'd produce these beautiful works. Some of them were colossal. I got to see a few of them in person at the different stages. They were taller than I was, but he had to line everything up, same way that you need to line everything up, and the paper would have to, maybe be a little bit bigger. And so you could put your registration marks so that you can line everything up very carefully, and you just do that. But then within the margin here that's going to come off, you'd have a crop mark. And then what would happen is you would come in with a big old paper cutter, and then you would just go in, assuming that I can get my product working here, go in and go swoop, cut that off, and then go swoop, cut that off, and then go swoop, cut that off, and then go swoop, cut that off. And if you cut it close enough to the crop marks, voila, you don't see those registration marks anymore. And you may not even see those test colors that you yourself dot in there, so that you can see and make sure that all the colors are as you expect. So that's how you could do it for a poster, but you can't cut down a shirt. So what do you do with a shirt? Well, what you can do instead, and I kind of touched on this very, very briefly. I think I will call this video miscellaneous information. What you do with the shirt is you lay it across something like a board, right? And you drape your t-shirt that you have across this board, and then on the back you could just tape it down or clamp it in place depending on what you're using, so that you have it folded almost like a display piece at Mervyn's or whatever. Is Mervyn's still around? I'm getting so old, people. I don't know what still exists. Is Forever 21 still a thing? I don't even know. So assuming Mervyn's still exists, where I do all of my shopping, of course, you'd stick that down, and then you do something like make sure that would fit snugly inside of your frame that you produce that has your screen on it. That way, every time you lock the shirt in place, you don't have to worry about a registration mark, because it's going to fit perfectly on each of these things. Just has to make sure that each of those screens that you produce had the screen stapled on before you burned the image in on it. All right, so that's a lot of miscellaneous information, but let me check the list. There is one other important thing. Let's say you're not doing spot color and you're just doing a 4-color process. When you do these color adjustments, especially with different color intents, you can end up with sometimes a much duller image than you initially started with. Let me open one up. Here we go. Such as the snail. For example, we could have like absolute chromatic or what have you. They're not, and let me get these swatches out of the way, they're not as bright as the original RGB. And you don't have to live with that. You can come in and do post-production adjustments, because this is a 4-color process. We're not relying on spot colors that are perfectly mixed, which means that we can go in and do something like a curves adjustment, assuming I can find it. Hello, curves. So on curves, notice it's set to CMYK, which means our curve is actually upside down this time because we're adding more ink or less ink. So just pay attention to where the lights and the darks are on your curve. So you might want to maybe lighten it up in some areas and darken it in other areas. In other words, an S curve. And look at that. Once you get something like that going in, you can create the illusion of vibrancy, which for sure, at least it's working within the constraints of the new CMYK world, the 4-color process world. So don't just sit there once something's been translated to CMYK and be like, guess that's it. Guess it's going to look dull. No, you can do more adjustments. Now, for sure, in CMYK, there are some things that are missing. For example, you can't do black and white. So you need to actually go back to RGB or a lab or some others to do black and white, then switch back to CMYK. But a lot of other ones do exist. You can do gradients, you can do levels, you can do hue and saturation. How crazy is that? You can crank up the saturation inside of a CMYK. Now, admittedly, you're not going to get colors that are brighter than CMYK can produce, but that's a good thing, right? That means that we're not going to end up with unreproducible colors. So if I come in here, I can't seem to sample anything because I need the Control-Alt-Shift-E so that I'm flat out on something, because I was sampling essentially a layer mask, which isn't working. All right, so you notice that as I click in here, none of these colors are producing that alert sign that we'd get from time to time, because these are all going to reprint because we're in CMYK. Now you could add a color in that wouldn't reprint, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to, actually, can we? Yeah, we can. We still have available to us 100% hue, saturation, whatever, which breaks outside of the CMYK and into the RGB. So do be aware that just painting can result in out-of-bound colors. But if you just do stuff like, hue, saturation, I crank this thing up to maximum and, it should still be perfectly fine. And again, I am flat out on the layer mask. All right, notice that even with the maximized saturation, it's still kept it within the constraints of CMYK. So that's something to keep in mind. You can do post-production. And feel free to do that on this assignment. In the demonstration I'm going to do, I probably will gloss over that. But write this down. you can, after you convert your image to CMYK, feel free to brighten it back up using whatever tools you have available before you put it inside of your smart object. That way you can have it brighten back up as much as you can and have it look as clear and clean as you can. All right, that is about it for my miscellaneous information. Do keep in mind that if you are using spot colors, don't do levels and hue and saturation and curves. That's going to change the color of your spot color. It's not the spot color anymore. If you tell your printer, the people running your printer, hey, I used this Pantone purple or some other company altogether, they're like, cool, and you didn't actually because you leveled it, you're not going to be happy with the results. So keep that in mind. But if you're doing a 4-color process, we're still within our bounds on all this stuff, which is a very interesting effect. Okay, so that's the miscellaneous information that I felt was important to bring up. And if you have any questions, by all means, email me. I am not an expert in print. I wouldn't claim to be an expert in print. I have done, posters, T-shirts, books, that kind of stuff. But I wasn't running the printing presses. I was just talking to the people running the printing presses and asking questions constantly. And I'd watch tutorials and I'd do research and I had classes, but this is a whole nother field. When I showed you that lithography going on, that Alphonse Mocha, I'm mispronouncing that. There's an endless variety of things you can do in print. It is a whole wide field. And if you're interested, pursue it. It's versatile. It's interesting. It's beautiful. But again, it's not my expertise. I'll be happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability, though. And on that note, let's dig into the assignment where we will have this virtual printer, which admittedly is not a very good printer. It can only do very large dots. So we'll move on and work around with that. Okay, catch you on the next video.